Hello, welcome to Pragem Technologies. I am Venkat. This is part 126 of ASP.NET video tutorial. In this video, we'll discuss about caching application data in ASP.NET. In parts 119 to 125 of the ASP.NET video tutorial, we discussed about caching web forms, caching multiple responses of web forms, fragment caching using user controls, caching multiple versions of user controls. If you haven't watched these videos, I would strongly encourage you to do so before continuing with the session. It is possible to store application data in the web server memory using the cache object so that the data can be retrieved faster. For example, let's say we have a stored procedure that takes 5 seconds to execute and return data. We can cache the data returned by this stored procedure within an ASP.NET web application using the cache object so that next time when we try to access the data, we can get it from the cache rather than reprocessing the stored procedure again. Let's see that in action. Let's flip to SQL Server Management Studio. I have TBL products table here, and I have a stored procedure here called sp get products. And if you look at the stored procedure, it's pretty simple. All it does is select star from TBL products, but before that we have this wait for delay. Now since this is a very small table and has got only 4 rows, if I execute this select star from TBL products, it's going to execute in less than a second. Just to introduce some artificial query processing time, I'm using this wait for delay here. So wait for delay, the first 2 zeros are the hours, the next 2 zeros are minutes, and the last 2 zeros are seconds. So I am blocking the execution of this stored procedure by 5 seconds using this wait for delay to introduce some artificial query processing time. So now if I execute the stored procedure, it's going to take at least 5 seconds because we are blocking the execution for 5 seconds using this wait for delay here. Okay, now let's see how to execute the stored procedure from within an ASP.NET web application, and then we'll try and cache the data that is returned by this stored procedure. So let's flip to Visual Studio. So here I have an ASP.NET web application project where we have this web form 1.aspx, and at the moment the design is pretty simple. I have a button control, I have a grid view control, and a label control. Okay, so if you look at the HTML, that's what you see here: a button control, grid view, and label control. Okay, in the code behind file, I have already written the ADO.NET code to retrieve, to basically execute the stored procedure sp get products and return the data. And if you look at that, it's the simple ADO.NET code. Okay, so if you're new to ADO.NET code, I would strongly encourage you to watch the ADO.NET video tutorial where we discussed about connecting to the database and executing commands and stored procedures. So basically, if you look at this here, we're using the configuration manager class to read the web.config connection string. So in web.config file, I have a connection string here, and the name of the connection string is db connection string, which is basically pointing to my SQL Server, local SQL Server database. So let's change the connection string to that. And then after we have the connection string, we are creating the SQL connection object, creating a SQL data adapter object, and we are specifying the stored procedure that we want to execute. In this case, sp get products, and this stored procedure will be executed using this connection object. And then we are specifying the command type as stored procedure because this is a stored procedure that we are executing. Creating a data set here, and then we are populating that data set with the results that we get back after we have the stored procedure executed. And look at this, the important thing to note here is that the return type of this method is a data set object. And look at this, finally we are returning the data set back. So pretty simple, straightforward ADO.NET code. Now let's say whatever data set that we get back by calling this method, we want to cache that data. So how do we do that? Caching data itself is pretty straightforward. All you need to do is use the cache object and then give it a key. So I can give any meaningful key. So here, as we are storing products data, I'm going to give it a key called products data. And then we can simply assign our data set. So we invoke this method, and then whatever this method is going to return, I am going to store in the cache object with this key. Okay, that's it. This is how we store basically the data in a cache. Now let's actually create a data set object. Let's call it ds, and then let's assign whatever this method is returning to that data set, and then let's use the data set to be stored in the cache. Alright, now let's assign this data set to the grid view control. So we have a grid view control with ID GV products. So I'm going to assign that data set as the data source for the grid view control. So GV products dot data source is equal to data set. And finally, let's go ahead and invoke the data bind method. And let's also say in the label I want to display the number of rows that we have in this data set. So to retrieve the number of rows in the data set, I use dataset dot, dataset is nothing but a collection of tables, and we know that this dataset contains one table. So dataset dot tables of 0, which returns the first table, and within that I want the number of rows, and then I can use the count property. So let's convert that to string. And let's say we have a label control again, which displays a message to the end user. So I'm going to set the text for that label. So label message dot text is equal to this line here will return the number of rows. So I'm going to append that to hard-coded string, basically saying rows retrieved. Okay, so very simple. All we have done so far is executed the stored procedure. Whatever data we have gotten back, we are storing the data in a data set, and then we are basically caching the data set using this key products data, and then we are setting the data set as the data source for the grid view control, calling data bind, and then displaying the number of rows that we have in that data table in a label control. Okay, so let's go ahead and run this. Actually, we have this code in page load. Instead of that, let's actually have this code in the button click event. So on this web form 1, I have this button. So when I click that button, that's when I want to do this. So I'm going to copy and paste that code there. So let's run this application. As you might expect, the first time when I click that button, it's going to take 5 seconds at least to execute that stored procedure. Okay, because this stored procedure will take 5 seconds at least because of this wait for delay. So the web form is still loading here. Once it loads up, now look at this. When I click this button, look at that, it is still processing. It's going to take at least 5 seconds for that data to be loaded into the grid view control. So 4 rows retrieved. Now let's modify this code a little bit so that even if I click now again, it's going to take 5 seconds again. Look at that, it's still processing. Why? Because every time you click the button, you're executing, you're calling that method, which in turn will execute that stored procedure, and it's going to take always 5 seconds to load. Instead of that, let's say if I already have this data in this cache, retrieve that from the cache rather than reprocessing the stored procedure every time. And to do that, so basically I'm saying if we will check, okay, is there if this cache object is null. So I'm basically saying if cache of products data not equal to null, okay, if it's not equal to null, then I want to retrieve data from the cache object. Else, if it is null, then we know that we don't have anything in the cache, in which case we want to call this method, execute the stored procedure, retrieve the data, and then put the data in a cache object, and then assign that as the data source for the grid view control. So now here let's slightly change this message. Since we are retrieving data from the database, I'm going to say whatever are the number of rows retrieved from database. Okay, and then I'm going to copy this just to avoid just to save some time in typing, and paste it here, and then we'll modify this. So if cache of products data not equal to null, then what I want to do is basically I want to retrieve the data set from the cache object. So instead of calling this method, I'm going to retrieve that from the cache object. So cache of products data. Now if you look at this cache object, look at what it is returning back. It is returning an object back. But what are we expecting? We are expecting a data set. So I can typecast that using the typecast operator to data set. And then look at that. What are we doing with the data set? We don't have to put it in the cache because it's already there in the cache. So I'm going to get rid of that line. We are simply setting the data set as the data source, calling data bind, and then we are displaying this message in the label. And here let's say whatever rows, 4 rows retrieved from cache. Okay, now another thing I want to do, I also want to, let's say, display the time it takes, when it is retrieving from cache, as opposed to, the time it takes when we have to load it from the database. And to do that, I'm going to do a small trick here. So let's use a datetime object, dt. Let's call this start time. So when I click this button, I'm capturing what is the current date and time on the server, and to do that I can simply use datetime.now. Okay, so this is going to return the current date and time when it is about to start processing this piece of code. So that's the start time. And similarly, let's go ahead and compute the end time. So when the processing reaches here, we know that it has completed processing. So I'm going to call this dt end time. That's the variable. Okay, now how do I find out the difference between start time and end time in seconds? It's pretty simple. Let's say end total seconds, for example, or total time is equal to, all we need to do is from the end time subtract the start time. So dt minus dt start time, and then we have a property called seconds. So when we subtract two dates, we have this property seconds, which returns the difference between that end time and start time in seconds. Convert that to string. Basically that's the integer, so let's store it in that variable. Okay, so now what I want to basically do here is, look at this, we are already appending this message to the label here. Instead of that, let's use a string builder object, build the message, and then finally we'll set that as the text for the label. And to do that, I'm going to use system.text. String builder class is present in system.text namespace, and let's call this sp message as the name of the variable. So new string builder. And what I am going to do here is, instead of assigning that message directly to the label, I'm going to append that to the string builder object. Okay, and I'm going to do the same thing here. Okay, finally here to the string builder object again, I'm going to append the time it took as well. So to the already existing message, I'm going to append, let's say for example, let's put a full stop here and a full stop here and maybe a space there and a space there, and then we'll append the number of seconds it took. So the total number of seconds is in this variable, so I'm going to take that, convert that to string using toString, and then maybe we can say 5 seconds load time. Okay, so now let's go ahead and run this and see what's going to happen. Let's rebuild the solution. So if you look at this, the code is pretty simple. Caching the data itself, very straightforward. All you need to do is use a key and then specify whatever data that you want to cache. Okay, and obviously we are using the cache object for that. Okay, and basically here we are checking if the cache of products data is not null, retrieve that products data from the cache object, typecast it to data set, store it in this variable, which is then set as the data source for the grid view control called data bind. And then here we are retrieving the number of rows that are present in that table. Okay, so let's go ahead and run this now. So control F5 to run the application. So when the web form loads up, when we click the button for the first time, it's going to execute the stored procedure and get the data from the database. Look at that, it's still processing. It's going to take at least 5 seconds, and we should be getting the data from the database. And we don't have the message there. That's basically because we haven't set that to the label. So let's go ahead and set that to the label. So lbl message.text is equal to whatever is there in the string builder object. So string builder object dot toString. And if you're wondering why we are using string builder object, why can't I use a string object? Anytime we are modifying strings, for performance reasons, it's always better to use string builder objects, because strings of type string are immutable, whereas strings of type string builder are mutable. If you want to know the differences between string and string builder object, we have discussed about that in the C# video tutorial, so please check that video. Alright, now let's build the solution once again and run it. Okay, so the first time when we click the button, it should take at least 5 seconds to execute the stored procedure. Look at that, it's still processing. Okay, and in 5 seconds time, look at that, 4 rows retrieved from database. Look at that, that's the message. And 5 seconds load time, so it took 5 seconds load time. Now when I click the button again, what's going to happen, it checks this here. Okay, if cache of product data not equal to null, that's true, so it will come here, retrieve the data from the cache, and then display that. So it has to be relatively faster. I click the button, look at that, 4 rows retrieved from the cache, 0 seconds load time. If you want to actually know the milliseconds as well, there is another property here. Instead of seconds, you can actually use dot total seconds. Okay, now let's run that. So total seconds actually returns a double, so let's convert that to be of double data type and run this now. So let's build this once again. So now when we click that button, it should show the time including the milliseconds. So when I click the button, it's going to take at least 5 seconds. This is the first time, so it has to execute the stored procedure. Look at that, it actually took 5 seconds and that many milliseconds. Now if I click that again, look at that, it literally took less than a second, I mean 0 seconds. Okay, and look at the message, 4 rows retrieved from cache. So no matter how many times you click now, it's going to load within a very less time, because we already have the data in cache. We don't have to re-execute the stored procedure, so our application is going to perform better. So in this video we discussed about storing application data in cache using direct assignment. That is, I have a cache key and then I'm assigning data to that key. Okay, in our next video we'll discuss about other options that are available to store data in the cache object. On this slide you can find resources for ASP.NET, C# and SQL Server interview questions. That's it for today. Thank you for listening. Have a great day.